Hello and welcome. Are you a freshman that's coming to high school for the first time? You don't really know what to do, you don't know what the differences are between high school and middle school? You want to figure out, find some information, some advice on how to get through it, how to be successful in high school? Well, this is the video for you. In this video, we'll be talking about three main big differences between high school and middle school. We'll start first with just the general differences between high school and middle school, overall, that kind of thing. The second part, we will talk about the academic differences, workload, rigor, professionalism, different standards that you're held to that are different than your middle school experiences. And then for our third part, we'll be talking about social differences between high school and middle school. How do you find friends? What are some good ways to build up good relationships, build your networks, that kind of thing. And so, without further ado, let's get on into the video. To start off, we're going to ask the question, what is the biggest difference between middle school and high school? Leave it to Jackson. The big difference between high school and middle school is that when you were in middle school, most of the schooling you did was looking into topics that was just like a beginner idea or just like a conceptual thing, so you can understand it later. When you get to high school is when you actually start going into depth with these subjects and really tackling them, trying to understand them. Now, from another perspective, we have Evelyn Rose, who's going to explain some of the differences between high school and middle school. What do you think was the biggest difference between high school?
For me, I think it was bigger projects. I guess like we did debate and stuff in high school. We have like a lot of debate, policy debate stuff, which we did not have in middle school. So a lot more public speaking projects specifically.
Now we're going to ask Jackson, what are some of the biggest academic differences between middle school and high school? What are the differences in, say, standard of work and rigor, that kind of thing? How did he overcome those problems? Simple things like that. For me personally, I think the biggest academics I noticed between high school and middle school were mainly the type of rigor that you would have to do. For instance, in middle school, you learn things more as like a theoretical concept, like, you do math and equations. And then when you go to high school, is less of a theoretical thing and more of an actually putting things into action kind of situation. Another big difference between high school and middle school when it comes to academics is that there is a different standard of professionality. In middle school, it's kind of okay to make mistakes. You're trying to learn, you're trying to figure things out. When it comes to high school, it's a lot more about taking the things you've learned and putting them into action. So you want to create documents and homework pieces that appear to be professionally made. You did them well. You intentionally wanted them to do well versus kind of, just throwing them together last minute. And up next, we'll have a testimonial from Nate Wolf, who's currently a sophomore at DeBakey High School. We'll talk a little bit about these academic differences between high school and middle school. Okay, so Nate, what were some of the biggest differences academically when you switched from middle school to high school in that specific area?
I would say a lot of it kind of the same with them. When you're still taking quizzes, tests, and group projects, I would say the rigor of the classes would increase exponentially, especially in the later years of high school. But usually it's like throughout the same, just harder classes.
And as for one final thing I would have to say about the differences between the academics of middle school and academics of high school is that I did run into a few problems. The rigor is a little bit more difficult. There's a lot more in-depth stuff in high school than middle school. So here's just a few problems I ran into that I will now help you with. So when I first switched from middle school to high school, these were my two biggest problems. My first problem was that I would go to class, do all the stuff I was supposed to, and I'd get homework. But then I'd forget to do the homework, and then I'd show up the next day and be like, oh, darn it, I forgot the homework. So, this is my solution for it. What I do is I always write out get a little piece of paper, and then I write down every single thing that's been assigned to me that day, and then cross it off to make sure I've gotten it done. That way, I would never miss any assignments. It was extremely helpful. Second problem I had when I switched from middle school to high school was I would take assignments kind of lightly. I'd see them, see when they're due, and then be like, oh, I'll just do them at the last second. This is not a good idea. Trust me, it's very tempting to kind of put things off to the last second, but it will bite you in the butt sooner or later. My advice for fixing this problem is just when you get an assignment, allot some time in your day, write down what time you're going to do the assignment, do it then in that day, and submit it. And then you're done. You're good. You're good to go. And now for the next question. So, what is the biggest difference between high school and middle school when it comes to social aspects? Well, I think one of the biggest differences between high school and middle school is the amount of people, for one, because you have more people, there's more kinds of friends you can have, more diverse interests, more friends you can relate to perhaps. And then the second one is also just because when you go to high school, you kind of are expected to be a little more professional just in your day-to-day activities and the way that you act around other people, acting in a professional manner. So there's more of a social anxiety to, act mannerly around other people. Another little word of advice for when it comes to going to high school for the first time, just make sure you relax. Don't get too anxious about other people judging you. There's a lot of people there usually, and usually you won't even stick out, Just lay back and try to enjoy yourself for a while. And now a little testimony from Charlie Wolf, who is currently a sophomore at Lamar High School. He will be telling us about the social differences between high school and middle school.
Okay. Charlie, what do you think was the biggest difference socially between high school and middle school, like the different attitudes and things? What do you think was different about those two environments?
I think, like I said earlier, just the environment, because in middle school, everyone kind of knows each other, I feel like, because it's smaller depending on the school you go to. And then in high school, it's like a big eye-opener because everyone's kind of in their own groups. So it's just a bigger, everything's bigger in high school.
Now we'll be asking the question, if I could give advice to my past freshman self when I was first entering into high school for the first time, what kind of advice would I have given them? For me personally, I think I would have just told myself to, number one, work hard, make sure when you're doing things, put out your best effort, make sure you're really, staying engaged in class, actually trying to learn the things, trying to generate an interest for those kinds of things. And I also would have said, just don't stress out too much about it. It's high school. Yeah, there's definitely hard parts, but overall, you don't need to stress out too much about it because you'll be able to get through it. It should be good as long as you do well, or you just try to do well in what you do, you should be fine. And now we will ask Mackenzie Walker, who is currently a junior at Liberty High School, what kind of advice would she have given to herself if she could have talked to her past freshman self when they first came to high school?
If you were to give advice to yourself when you were coming in as a freshman a year ago, what kind of advice, what advice would you give to yourself?
Enjoy having fun with your friends while you can, and don't stress too much about school because it's not going to last forever. It's not that important. It's important, but
Yeah.
It's not the only thing that matters,
You would say that, would you say that, academics, those are important, but that but the friends you make and, the connections you make, those things really matter maybe a little?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, also, make sure to put yourself first and, take care of yourself And if school is not helping that, then make sure to take time and look out for yourself.
And now it's time for a little summarization of what we learned today. So now it's time to make a quick summarization of what we learned today. The first thing we learned today was some general differences between high school and middle school. Some of these general differences are just differences in rigor and understanding concepts. For instance, you delve much further into concepts in high school than you do in middle school when you're given more of a brief explanation as to how different, say, scientific mechanics work. General things like that. There's also differences in attitude. There's a more professional attitude towards high school than there is towards middle school. We then asked the question, what are some of the biggest academic differences between high school and middle school? And here's what we found out. There were two main differences between high school and middle school that we talked about. One of them was that in subjects you go more in depth. You move from theoretical, just looking at how things work, to actually putting them into action. Actually doing projects, labs, like in chemistry and physics, that kind of thing. The other thing we also talked about was professionality. When you move from middle school to high school, there is a higher level of professionality that you need to move into. For our third topic, we talked about the social differences between high school and middle school. Some of the biggest social differences are that in middle school, you kind of act a little immature, playing around, making silly jokes, stuff. In high school, there's much less of that, I would say. There's much more of, obviously humor is amazing and it's a good idea, but there's more, clever humor and that kind of thing. Another thing that Charlie Wolf touched upon was the fact that in middle school, it's a lot smaller, so everyone kind of knows each other. It's not really as cliquey necessarily. But when you move to high school is when you really kind of start seeing how people separate in the world. You start seeing these cliques, and then you see these networks kind of developing around you, which is a very mature thing and a very interesting thing to start learning as you become. In the last section, we asked the question of what kind of advice would you give to yourself if you could talk to your high school self, your freshman self when they first came into high school. A lot of people said things like, take it easy, don't worry too much, high school is rough, it's definitely hard, but it's not forever. You can get through it. Many other people have. One other thing is just don't be lazy. Make sure you really put effort into the things you're doing, because if you cut corners, it's going to bite you in the butt later. You don't want to do that. I am Jackson Taylor, and I certainly hope you enjoyed this video presentation on a freshman's guide to high school. It was a pleasure doing it, and thank you.